Okay. Wow. This is so exciting. We're all together for the first time in a while. Well, my name is Jennifer Gibbons, and I'm the Executive Director of the Pratt Museum. And I'm so pleased to welcome all of you here tonight, everyone who's in the room, and all of you who are joining us on Zoom. Thank you so very much. I would like to also thank our members, our donors, all of our supporters, including the City of Homer and the Homer Foundation, who make all of our work possible. So thank you all very, very much. I'd also like to pause for just a moment for all of us to reflect on the fact that as we gather here tonight, we gather on the traditional homelands of the Dena'ina and Sugiyaq people. And for all of you online, to give you a moment to reflect upon the traditional homelands where you're gathering tonight. And if we can just pause for a moment. Thank you. So we have two distinguished authors with us tonight, and in a moment we're going to hear from Nancy Ward, who's going to introduce our featured guest tonight, Tom Kizzia. I want to thank Jenny Stroyak and the Homer Bookstore for inviting us to partner with them on this exciting evening, and also Jeremy, where are you, Jeremy? Jeremy Bataki from Porphyry Press, who has made this book come alive. So thank you so very much, Jeremy. You're here. Following the presentation tonight, we invite you all to join us in the community room. You will be able to enjoy more of Ron Snugget's work that's surrounding us tonight, as well as some refreshments from Redbird Kitchen. So now I would like to welcome Nancy Ward. Nancy's a longtime friend and supporter of the Pratts. I'm always happy to see her. She's a writer. She's an author of many, many books. I'm sure many of you have read her books, both fiction and nonfiction. She's also a former Alaska Writer Laureate, and Nancy is going to introduce Tom Kizzia. Thank you, Nancy.
Okay. Well, I don't need to introduce Tom because they're all his friends and fans. Probably know him quite well, but back at Hampshire College in Massachusetts in 1970. And we were both sort of aspiring writers, but Tom was actually working at it, quite serious. And anyway, and I was not serious. But Ken Kastner back here and I left college and came to Homer in 1973. And I was thinking about this today, Tom gave us a book, Edward Hoagland's Notes from the Century Before, and inscribed it in the beginning for Ken and Nancy, who went ahead. And Tom came up to visit a couple of years later and ended up being the editor of the Homer News for a while. And then later moved on to the Anchorage paper and had a full career there. So when I was thinking about that book today, Edward Hoagland's Notes from the Century Before, which is about a visit that he made in the late 60s to part of British Columbia, just up river from Wrangell, and he wrote about the people who were living in that country, and it was kind of they were like old miners and old homestead people, and it was like sort of older people, and he was capturing something about the lives of them, and I think that book meant a lot to Tom and me. It was, if you recall that time, there was really not much what we would call literature from Alaska, and so we kind of glommed onto that. Anyway, so Tom's first book, Wake Up the Unseen Object, came out of his reporting for the Anchorage paper, and I would say those years in the 70s and the 80s was, looking back, I think pretty exciting time for Alaska, and Tom took advantage of that to become a really good writer. I Wake Up the Unseen Object has now been re-released, copies over there by the University of Alaska Press in their classic series. So then I think you all know the Pilgrim's Wilderness, which also grew out of reporting that Tom did for the Anchorage paper. And now we have Cold Mountain Pratt, which grew out of the Pilgrim book. Tom will tell you about that. But one final thing I just want to say about Tom's writing altogether, and why I admire it so much is the painstaking research that he's always done. And I think, the accuracy and the truthfulness of what he writes, and especially we can admire more now in the time when that's not always the case in reporting or otherwise. But Tom also is a great storyteller and has always done a really good job of telling the stories of people and engaging them in ways that where he can tell their stories without hurting anyone. And I think that that's an amazing thing. So, okay, so enough. Please welcome Tom.
They said I could take my mask off, but I don't want to shock you that I'm not 25 years old. Thank you to the museum, and especially to Holly for setting all this up, and to Jennifer and to Nancy for the introduction. I think after 50 years, Nancy could have said a lot more things. Gosh, I was really excited. It's great to be here and see everyone. See all these familiar half faces. Because 2 days ago I did a book launch on Zoom, and it was all Zoom, and it's hard to talk about your new book to Zoom because you just don't know. I mean, you tell a joke, nobody responds. In my mind, they're all swerving restlessly, So if you can yawn under your mask. I think it's a good way to do it. So there were certain things that I didn't feel like I could read on the Zoom, so I'm going to read those tonight instead. But you don't. If you did tune in on Wednesday, I'm not going to read any more of Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That was a one-time only. Czesław Miłosz, the Nobel laureate from Poland, said, when a writer is born into a family, the family is finished. This famous line, and I've been thinking about that the last couple of years as I worked on this book. I wonder if that same rule applies to small towns. when a writer arrives in a small town, but then I decided if that's true, Homer is toast. But I think not. I think the social contract in the small town gives us reason to edge toward kindness and understanding and a little distance on things that it's sometimes hard to get in your own family. But I would try to think about that in relation to McCarthy, which I also consider, myself part of that community as well, more peripherally than in Homer, for sure. So the new book is, as you probably know, is a history of McCarthy in the half a century between the time the mines shut down out there and the coming of the national park. And so there are kind of two twining origin stories for this book. And I write about them both in the beginning of the book. One of them is when I wrote the Pilgrim Pilgrim's Wilderness book, I wrote some chapters of history about the area because Papa Pilgrim had showed up and he was claiming the mantle of the Alaska frontier to justify his lifestyle and what his opposition to the park. And so I wanted to show the reader what had really gone on in the time before the park. And so I wrote a couple of chapters about that history, but my editor in New York thought, it was getting in the way of the main story of the family, and really the story of the children trying to escape from their father. And it was a really good call. So we pulled those chapters out of the book, and I kind of summarized a little of the history as all. So then when the book came out, I did a reading like this at the Kennecott Rec Hall up in Kennecott. And they wanted me to read from some of the lost chapters, the parts that I had pulled out. And they were such a hit, the parts that weren't in the book. And they came to me and they said, we really would love to have those chapters for the museum. Can we, get copies of what you just read? And I said, well, why don't I just sort of make them into a little book, and then you could have it as a fundraiser for the museum. And so that was kind of the idea, but once I started work on it, it just kind of became a 3-year project. So the first thing I was going to read tonight, and it's a bit longer, because that's why I didn't want to do it last night, is the story that I read at the Kennecott Rec Hall that got everybody so excited there at Kennecott. It's about a guy who showed up in 1971 in McCarthy, who was a real showboat. And the original chapter did capture that showboat quality, but I learned a lot more for where we are now. And I didn't know at that time the curse of the skulls. So now I've added that to the story. And I have to back up for this reading to tell you a little bit from the first part of the chapter so that you'll know who the characters are when the main character shows up. This is from the chapter called The Hippie Hole. The first thing Loy and Curtis Green noticed about McCarthy when they climbed out of the plane in 1967 was the sky, a dark pre-industrial blue above the white peaks, and the quiet. In Chitna, where they had lived for the previous few years, a private generator ran 24 hours a day. To the Green brothers, it had been a noisy reminder of the two-car garage civilization they had fled in one of the first waves of 1960s restlessness to reach the Wrangles. Lloyd and Curtis were Dharma bums from Colorado who carried copies of Thoreau and Whitman to the end of the road in Chitna. On the day they flew to McCarthy, Fred Potts was their pilot. Potts came from wealth in Los Angeles and once explored Afghanistan and lingered in the sands of Tangier with William Burroughs and Paul Bowles. Fred's wife, Dolly, was a sharp cheekboned beauty who caused a stir in Chitna with her knee-high leather high-heeled boots, miniskirt, and holstered .44 Magnum. Her eyelids were tattooed with eyeshadow. People said Dolly Potts had once appeared smiling on a swing on a Coca-Cola poster. Fred was the chief pilot for FEPCO Aviation, which stood for Fred Potts. The schedule was limited. FEPCO generally flew only in early morning before the mountain day breezes picked up. Much of his time was devoted to writing a critical study of classical music. Research for this, according to Curtis Green, consisted of playing an LP of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, the first and second movements, over and over while he made bullets. Every afternoon when he had enough bullets, he stopped the music and stepped outside with his pistol for target practice. The Greens were drawn to McCarthy by an employment offer from Gordon Burdick, a pot-smoking cat skinner and raconteur who had been a Marine and fought in the Pacific and played basketball for Seattle Pacific College. Ever since leading the nuclear bomb scientists on their tour of the Bonanza mine, that's another chapter, he had been second-guessing the pillar retreat strategy of Kennecott's engineers, convinced he could take out every other pure copper ore column left behind in the mines to keep the roof from collapsing without having the roof collapse on him. Burdick stayed busy doing annual assessment work on unpatented mining claims staked all over the country. He hired the Greens to help him reopen the wagon road up McCarthy Creek. It wasn't a paying job per se, as Curtis Green recalled, or a promise of sharing in untold future riches. Progress up McCarthy Creek on a little Caterpillar D2 was slow, Curtis recalled. Morning started around 10 o'clock with strong coffee in town at the hardware store. Residing beside a Queen Monarch chrome and enamel cook stove taken from the superintendent's house in Kennecott, Burdick rapped with Loy and Curtis about gold prices and the Vietnam War, while his wife, Frida, whose savings had bankrolled the mining venture, pushed him sarcastically to get to work. She called him Action Jackson. Frida would be bustling about, making lunch, in and out of the kitchen, pushing Gordon to get a move on, Curtis wrote. The harder she pushed, the more he stalled. So that was the guys in the late 60s settling into McCarthy. So then there were some others who came in that same period. There was Les and Flo Hegland and their 10-year-old daughter. They came from North Dakota and were kind of straight folks. And Jim Edwards and Maxine Edwards and their family, they're kind of the family who tied this whole book together because Jim Edwards was there from the early 50s and actually knew the people who stayed behind when Kennecott Copper closed. So his story could bring us up to the present. And then there was Winnie Darko, who was the owner of the McCarthy Lodge, the local bar. And he was kind of the Nixonian law and order guy there in 1971. He was very concerned about what he called the environmentalist hippie commie threat. And the environmentalist hippie commie threat had established at Beachhead deep in the Wrangles by 1971, where the Chittestone River flows into the headwaters of the Nizina. Spruce Point had once been an overnight roadhouse on the trail of the Nizina and over a pass to the Shoshana gold fields. The valley's first back to the land commune flourished in an old cabin there in the summer of 1970, as the chief pilot for Bethco Aviation hosted a group gathered around a prophetic type named Loping Bear, who retained his name even after Dolly Potts killed a grizzly near the camp with her bear pistol. According to Curtis Green, the site was inauspicious for settlement because Fred Potts didn't trust the water and insisted on hauling 5-gallon jugs in his plane from Anchorage, more than 200 miles away. Before long, Dolly and the rest of the commune moved away, leaving a young, long-legged mate for Fred, who had taken the name Belphegor after Fred's favorite horse. Not long after that, Frida Burdick gave up on her investment in Gordon and moved out, declaring her husband, quote, so crooked he had to screw his pants on in the morning. In 1971, long-haired college students arrived, notebooks in hand, deployed to the Wrangles by an environmental studies program at the University of California, Santa Cruz. But it was the arrival in the spring of 1971 of an outlaw who called himself Raven and the excavation of the hippie hole that marked McCarthy's coming of age as a 1960s culture end of the road town. Which is a trick because they didn't have a road. It was coming, and as soon as it started to come, they developed that quality. Raven wore a feather in his black cowboy hat and decorated his .44 Magnum holster with a beaded peace symbol. 2 skulls dug out of the McCarthy cemetery sat on a table by his bed with candles burning in the eye sockets. His real name was Ron Cole, though nobody called him that. He was a Marine vet in his 30s who had gone to Korea as a teenager, slight but tough, with a prominent Fu Manchu mustache. In the spring of 1971, he showed up in McCarthy with a pigtailed girlfriend barely out of her teens, a new buddy named Jim, and several hundred marijuana starts. Young Jim had just inherited land in McCarthy and received a nice insurance settlement. Passing fat joints around the hardware store with Lloyd, Curtis, and Gordon Burdick, Raven laid out his plans for Jim's money. A 5-story resort lodge built out of logs with a full basement devoted to year-round cultivation of top quality weed. He said pot was practically legal in the libertarian North, although the eventual Supreme Court decision allowing personal consumption up here was still a few years away. And he said, McCarthy had a long and respected speakeasy tradition. So Les and Flo Hegland, the older couple from North Dakota, took an immediate disliking to Raven, who was making a strong impression on their 14-year-old daughter, Janet. But at first, with $100 bills from the insurance settlement fluttering around town, there were a few complaints. Lloyd Green recalled that Winnie Darko, the town's leading law and order advocate, happily accepted Raven's money while serving as his unlicensed air taxi, flying the entrepreneur back and forth to his truck in Chittenden. Gordon Burdick used his bulldozer to dig out the foundation for the marijuana lodge. The hole had to be deep enough to support a log structure of several stories. Curtis noted drolly that this was the only foundation work Burdick ever undertook, and it was for someone else's castle in the air. Jim and Maxine Edwards lived across the street and observed that the hippie hole, as they dubbed it, was being excavated on a lot the hippies didn't own. Jim Edwards, who kept his hair cropped short, not as political commentary, but so it could be cleaned with a washcloth, looked on the new developments with bemusement rather than horror. There was a guy sitting out in front of a tent with an Indian-type headband around his head and smoking marijuana, he recalled. Two young girls scurrying around, taking care of his needs. He was just looking at the sunshine. This was in the days when people had general resistance to hippies. I would go to Cordova or somewhere and continually meet somebody who'd say, "You got any hippies out there?" As if it were some disgusting thing that might have happened to us, like the plague descending on McCarthy. Eventually, Raven and Darko had a falling out, and the law was waiting to pounce. They'd been watching Ron Cole since his drug dealing days in Cordova. A uniformed state trooper flew to McCarthy with a couple of plainclothesmen and hauled Cole back to town for an expired driver's license and a few parking tickets. By the time he got back to McCarthy, his buddy Jim had split for South America, leaving an empty hippie hole in the middle of town. Raven told young Janet Hegland he was high on mescaline when he dug up the skulls in the graveyard. He now turned his menacing energies to pilfering old implements from other buildings as he guarded his marijuana plants. The supervisor of the Santa Cruz College program recalled an afternoon at the hardware store when two earnest undergraduates posed questions about modern day mining practices to a gregarious and obviously stoned Gordon Burdick, while Raven glared out the window behind a nearby curtain with a rifle across his lap. Trouble was brewing and everybody seemed in the mood. Darko played sheriff and kept Les Hegland on edge about what the hippies might pull next. Les yelled at Jim Edwards for transporting Raven on the mail plane. Jim replied, he was a common carrier open to all. Les has lost his head, Edwards wrote. I guess he's been hating so much it's ate him up. Things boiled over in late summer when Raven's 14-year-old daughter came to visit. Raven approached Darko in the street, gun in beaded holster, and said, "Okay, Winnie, it's just you and I." Flo Hegland called the troopers about the 6-foot-tall pot plants her husband reported stumbling upon. A lodge employee stopping by the Hegland house to pick up mail overheard Flo's radio call and warned Raven, who slipped out of the hardware store with his daughter and disappeared at McCarthy Creek. Troopers waited in town for a day before departing with Raven's girlfriend and his pot plants. A vigilante committee was formed by Darko, but the small posse, driving in a blue ambulance, decided not to follow Raven into the ambush zone of the steep wall of McCarthy Creek Valley. Days later, participants in the Santa Cruz program were hiking near the Bonanza near Kennecott, above Kennecott, when they spotted Raven and his daughter coming over the knife-edge bridge. The two had ascended a sheer face on the opposite side above the old Motherlode mine. Students let out a yodel in greeting. Raven waved his rifle, later telling him it was good that he recognized the yodel where he might have shot. He was carrying a transistor radio to listen for messages from his lawyer on Caribou Clatters, Bush Message show on Glen Allen's Christian AM station. Lloyd Green recalled, he spent about 2 weeks up there without food, really roughing it. Then he made his way clear around the back of McCarthy Creek, skirting the glacier and coming into McCarthy the back way. People met that night at the hardware store to hatch a plan. They didn't support Raven's drug lifestyle, they said, but at least he wasn't a hypocrite. He was desperate, Loy said. It was fall of the year and it was really getting cold. We figured we can't have him staying here. Somebody's going to get killed, not by Raven, but by the posse. They were the dangerous ones. Loy put Raven's daughter, disguised as a Santa Cruz student, on the mail plane. They didn't want Jim Edwards to get in more trouble for piloting fugitives. A Super Cub pilot with connections flew out from Anchorage soon after to grab Raven. 2 weeks after that, in early October, the fugitive returned in a pickup truck over the rough road the state had started improving with his girlfriend and his daughter to collect all the mining era booty he'd left at the hardware store. Unfortunately for him, it snowed that night. When Dargo spotted their footprints, the three of them took off in their Chevy pickup, splashing across the freeze-up trickle in the Kennecott River, bouncing toward Chittenden. Dargo grabbed his son and Les Heglin, and they flew to the Collins airstrip at Long Lake, 15 miles away, where they were reinforced by an Alaska State Trooper plane. The fugitive ran into the woods and was caught. Having the troopers there helped. When Heglin got back to town, his daughter recalled, he realized his shotgun hadn't been loaded. It was rare in those days for an event in the Wrangles to merit newspaper attention, but an 8-inch unbylined story of the arrest under the headline, "The Law Swoops," reported that a state trooper plane landed on the road in front of Ron Paul's car to block his getaway. The story said the suspect was chased down in the woods by troopers, the pilot, and other citizens. That was as close as the Anchorage Times got to using the word vigilantes. The October 1971 story provided this background. Cole was wanted for possession following the alleged discovery of marijuana being grown in a garden at his cabin in McCarthy. No mention was made of grave robbing and human skulls. Les Heglin led the troopers to the cemetery where they found 2 holes in the ground. Had to guess which skull belonged where. Tomb robbing was rather a way of life in McCarthy, but everybody felt Raven had gone too far. Things turned out badly for Ron Cole's own cranium. A few years later, in a forest north of Anchorage, a sow grizzly attacked him before he could draw his pistol. His new wife, Darcy, who was 21, took the mirror off the wall before helping him into the cabin. The bear had torn off his face. Cole came through with a glass eye, surrounded by scars, and a bear attack story that won the Alaska Airlines Alaska Brag Contest in October 1975. The airline ran a newspaper advertisement celebrating the winner with a photo of smiling Darcy and a tagline that read, "Nobody knows Alaska like Alaska knows Alaska." The prize was quietly revoked shortly thereafter once the airline learned of the winner's recurrent role as a defendant in major drug cases. Alaska Magazine published a story anyway in 1976. Quote, "She was trying to eat my head, and from the pain, I was sure she'd succeeded. I tried beating her with my hands, but it was like trying to break rock." 1 year after his bear story appeared, Cole was charged with shipping half a ton of marijuana to Alaska in sealed 55-gallon oil drums. At the time, it was the biggest marijuana bust in the state's history. Ron Cole reached the end of his road in 1981 in a big home on the Anchorage hillside when a cocaine dealer who owed him money shot him through the skull, and Darcy too. In the Anchorage papers, narcotics officers described the deceased male victim, age 45, as one bad Jose, who went by the name of Raven. Read that story, so thanks. So yeah, that's why this became a 3-year project, because there was everywhere I looked, there were these great stories. And but the other, I said there were 2 origin stories. The other is spelled out in the prologue, which was the story of my first visit to McCarthy in 1983 as a police reporter to cover the mass murder that had happened out there. And that was a story that I wrote at the time, but that really kind of haunted me for a long time. Trying to figure out how to how to write about that, or what to say, something more than the newspaper stories I've written. Kind of my quest, my white whale, was chasing this story, and so the book became a way to weave the two together. Now, when I had the idea for this book, I was talking with Jeremy, who lives in McCarthy, about doing this local history of the area at a particular time and place. But I did sort of check in New York with, my editor at Crown, who had, published the Pilgrim book, to see if there was any interest there in a book like this. And it was interesting because if there was interest, it was kind of in the murders and in a true crime book that would, to build up and be focused around that event. And I didn't want to write that book. I didn't want to tell the story just that way. I wanted it to be the local history. And obviously the murders exert a kind of gravitational force on the rest of the story. And by the end of the book, that's really what I'm writing about. But it wasn't the kind of book that New York was talking about. So I was glad to do the story of sort of the white pioneer experience in Alaska. And I say that because I look upon this project kind of as a bookend to the earlier book that I wrote, Wake of the Unseen Object, which was about the Alaska Native world of the 1980s, when I had this amazing job for the Anchorage Daily News to travel in rural Alaska and go wherever I wanted off the road and to write about, just to tell people in Anchorage what it was like out there. So because this is my hometown audience, I'm going to veer away from the new book for a minute and go to the Wake of the Unseen Object. Because it has a new introduction where I talk about the what it was like to be a reporter showing up in villages and writing about the Native culture in the 1980s, and how different that would be in today's world. So I kind of really trying to get the Anchorage Daily News to run this introduction. I think they keep promising to, but they haven't yet. Because I just want to stick my neck out and get involved in the arguments that the cultural arguments everybody's having right now. But so far they haven't engaged me, so I'm going to just read a couple of paragraphs from it here to try to stir something up. So this series that I wrote was called North Country Journal, the Anchorage Daily News, the original series that I rewrote short stories into a kind of continuous travel narrative for this book. So the presumptuousness of reporting a series like North Country Journal would be more apparent today. In an era of heightened concern about cultural appropriation, Alaska Native readers might well cringe at the haphazard pedagogy of a visiting journalist. If this portrait of a place holds up, it's thanks to the counsel of some of Alaska's wisest minds of that era, Native and non-Native, who trusted my previous work enough to coach me, to describe for me the structures of village life and the visible wake in the present day of Russian and American expansion in the 19th century. Those guides, rarely named in the book, pointed to places and to people. Some of them seemed to appreciate that, although we didn't talk in those days about decolonization and white privilege, I traveled and wrote with a sense of the blinders to my own perception. Indeed, challenging the presumptions of the dominant culture, looking from a distance back toward the alien spaceship of Anchorage, was a deep theme of this project from the start. The goal was not to sort between various claims of authority within the Native community, but to emphasize for urban readers in the modern oil era, the underlying geographical and moral historical case for tribal consultation. That is, for acknowledging the rightful place in Alaska life of the land's indigenous people. So that was my new introduction to old work, trying to keep it relevant, right? So then the new book was kind of looking at the experience of the culture that moved in on top of the native culture, and in the case of the Wrangels, essentially flushed the people out of the whole valley. So they're not really part of the story from 1938 to 1983, except that I have several places where I describe sort of what became of them. So one thing I did 2 nights ago on the Zoom was I went through the whole book and thinking about this effort to tell the story of the white pioneer experience. I picked out 10 short little passages that I thought kind of encapsulated what I was trying to get at in this book, apart from telling juicy stories about, you know, renegades and outlaws. So tonight I'm just going to read 2 of those parts. 2 of those, they're very short sections, just to kind of highlight the theme of, you know, some of the themes that I was looking at. You know, when I wrote about the Alaska Native cultures, I really came away from that book with more questions than answers. You know, more questions even than I had starting. And that was somewhat true in this new project, in that I was trying to figure out what is the American cultural interest in ghost towns. What's the meaning that ghost towns carry for Americans? And because McCarthy and Kennecott are unrivaled as a ghost town. So first short section is from 1975, when this is during the big fight over whether to create national parks in Alaska, and the Wrangels was front and center in that fight. And in the midst of that, in 1975, John Denver came to McCarthy with a film crew to make a movie to promote conservation. And, you know, there was lots of scenery of the mountains and shots of this and that, but the movie couldn't tear its eyes off of Kennecott, the industrial ruins. So I wanted to address that. In his book, in his autobiography, John Denver described Kennecott as a wild streak of industrial violence that just sits there brooding in the night. It might seem odd that a movie about preserving Alaska's wilderness would linger amid the frontier ruins of industrial capitalism, but the allegorical setting actually suited the times. The conservationists' fundamental truth about the environment winning in the end presses itself constantly upon a visitor's imagination in the Wrangels, there being no greater illustration than Kennecott itself. Juxtaposed against the propulsive boosterism of Alaska's modern oil boom, in which Alyeska Pipeline had replaced Guggenheim Trust, Kennecott's ruins provided an almost religious tableau, a place where spiritual reassurance might be found in the atmosphere of decline and fall, in the inning when nature bats last. So every once in a while I would find myself writing something that, oh, there I hit it. So that was one, that's why I wanted to read that. There's one other where I talk about the efforts to preserve Kennecott once it fell under national park jurisdiction, or as it was about to fall under, and the debate was going on. How do we preserve this place? Because it's going to fall apart if we don't do something. It's going to go completely back to nature. But on the other hand, we don't really want to get all fancy, and they refer to it as Disneyfication. They didn't want to make a Disneyland park of Kennecott. So how do you find something in between? Looking for some in-between solution, a group of McCarthy residents settled on a concept they called arrested decay. Kennecott's structures would be shorn up just enough to keep them from collapsing. The ambition was to preserve poignant sunset beauty of the ruins. The passing of time itself would be visible in their half-fallen state, and each park visitor would have the opportunity to experience a sense of discovery anew. Advocates for this approach said they were speaking of architecture, but they might well have been addressing their hopes for the community itself. They struggled to envision an idealized middle way, not heretofore achieved in the American experiment, in which their town would neither be erased by a back to nature effort, nor bloated by easy access into a commercial center. Arrested decay, arrested development. Only McCarthy could stay somewhere in between, never losing its balance with nature, sustaining this perfectly poised historical moment. That perfectly poised moment brings me to the last piece part that I wanted to read. And that is the story of a woman named Amy Ashenden, who came late to the community, came in 1982. And and she's the one who gave me the title for the book, Story of Her Life. So this description of her, there's the book, comes from February of 1983. I describe who was living in the community in 1983, that winter of February. That was 2 weeks before, this was about 2 weeks before the March 1, 1983 murders, in which 6 people were killed. So it starts talking about Tim Nash, who was the bearded mountain man who lived along the road to Count Cotton. He was strong enough to drive a nail with a choked up sledgehammer, and he once told the park superintendent he would defend his cabin with a gun. But he was a gentle soul, everyone said. Friends knew he'd had a rough year, alone, depressed, after his wife left. And then, the previous summer, 1982, a short, apple-cheeked, 25-year-old backpacker named Amy Ashenden climbed off the mail plane. She was auburn-haired and strong-shouldered and uncommonly well-read. She wore plain work clothes and had an air of quiet curiosity. She made friends and hiked across the glacier to explore a drained lake bed filled with ice cubes. Then she settled in as a cabin sitter and started writing in her journal. Amy had grown up in western Massachusetts on a former dairy farm outside the small town of Shelburne Falls. She excelled in private school and graduated from Harvard with a degree in comparative religion. Yet she puzzled her family and considered her clever but excessively critical, moody, discontented, burdened by the so-called conveniences of the material world. Her college honors thesis, exploring Buddhist asceticism, was titled Climbing Up the Cold Mountain Path. The title came from the poetry of Han Shan, an 8th century Tang dynasty hermit who used landscape imagery to describe a state of mind. And this is the book of Han Shan poems, Cold Mountain Poems. They were translated beautifully by Gary Snyder, and this is a book that she carried with her and recommended. And it became, as I realized how it pertained to everything else I was writing, it became, among other things, one of the Cold Mountain Poems became the epigraph for this book. I'm going to read that now. They're very short. Clambering up the Cold Mountain path, the Cold Mountain trail goes on and on. The long gorge choked with scree and boulders, the wide creek, the mist-blurred grass. The moss is slippery, though there's been no rain. The pine sings, but there's no wind. Who can leave the world's ties and sit with me among the white clouds? Other lines from there. Cold Mountain has many hidden wonders. People who climb here are always getting scared. When the moon shines, water sparkles clear. At the wrong season, you can't ford the creeks. long time, Amy had been trying to impose greater spiritual discipline in her own life. The opportunity to follow this path to Alaska came along by chance. She found seasonal work in national parks during college, then a job at a mountain hut in New Hampshire run by the Harvard Mountaineering Club. A climber boyfriend from the hut took her to Alaska. In Fairbanks, she worked in a bookstore and lived in a house of skiers and climbers. After 2 winters, she broke up with her boyfriend and, impatient with the urban climber grunge of Fairbanks and her own lack of perseverance, resolved to spend 1 whole summer in real wilderness before giving up. She caught a ride to Glen Allen and flew to McCarthy on the mail plane. Immediately, she recognized the landscape of her thesis. What surprised her, though, she wrote in her journal, was finding a community of kindred spirits. Ever since I bought that pair of snowshoes in 7th grade, she wrote, I think one of the best dreams has been to be living simply in a place like this. I really feel this is the lifestyle I most want to explore right now, and I feel good about doing it alone. Good people, neighbors to learn from, and the heightened energy and motivation which comes to me from living close to the mountains makes me feel a great potential. The ghost town landscape offered abundant lessons in Buddhist impermanence. The history of this area is basically recorded only in the memory of old timers, so it's hard to learn about, but the feeling of history is rich, Amy wrote to her parents. David and Joe Ashington flew up from Massachusetts to check on the welfare of their daughter. Amy walked them excitedly around McCarthy and described her plans to stay. The visit went well at first, until her mother took a walk around Kennecott, alone in a misty mountain rain, observing how, quote, all the old buildings of this once bustling community had deteriorated just enough to give the area a sort of charm that inspires certain minds to reclamation. On the porch of a small red house, she saw a man, tall and balding, polishing a rifle. He glared at her, as if impatient for her to get out of his sight. She turned away. It rained heavily all the next day as Joe Ashington tried to talk Amy out of spending the winter in such a dark and dismal place. But soon it was September, the most beautiful month of the Wranglers. The mountainsides of aspen, birch, and poplar blazed gold in low-angle sunlight. After a summer of camping in high valleys, Amy had lined up a small place of her own near Kennecott and started preparing for winter. From Al Gagnon, she bought insulated mouse boots and a shotgun. She received many offers of help. She wrote to reassure her parents, a single woman really awakens the protective male instinct in an environment like this. Tim Nash had black ringlets and a body carved of marble. He was 12 years older than Amy and emotionally reticent. She was impressed that he hunted all his meat, grew all his own vegetables, and built with local materials whenever possible. He was a person who thought about how best to spend each day. A lot of people talk about these things, she said, but it's so refreshing to meet someone who really lives by his principles, is what she wrote in her journal. He's also very much attuned to physical health and is in amazing shape. When I watch him literally shoulder a tree and walk to his woodpile with it, I really can't quite believe what I'm seeing. Like other McCarthy bachelors before him, Tim Nash wasted no time. Amy settled into Tim's cabin and into a Neolithic lifestyle. In November, she wrote her parents that they were engaged. The couple flew back east to Shelburne Falls at Christmas. Her parents said they'd never seen Amy more radiant. Tim split firewood for Amy's father and built a bookcase for her mother. They borrowed a car and drove to Tim's boyhood home in Floodwood, Minnesota, where the former comparative religions major marveled in a letter. They were married by his mother's parish priest. I, who haven't been baptized, and Tim, an atheist. After 2 months away, Tim and Amy just returned to Tim's cabin up the path toward Kennecott. On Valentine's Day, friends brought them a quarter of a moose for a welcome home and a mincemeat pie with a heart carved on top. The sunlight had come back. Amy would write her parents in late February. The dark days were over. We've got this winter licked. Boy, is it good to be home, and it is also pretty wonderful to be Mrs. Nash. few days later, Amy would write a more intimate letter to a female hiking friend, in which she said she finally felt on the right path. It seems like ages since I've sitten. Is that really a word? I honestly can't remember. Down to write, the Harvard graduate began. I guess ever since I studied Asian ways of thought and value systems in school, I realized that the real work of my life is not to have fun, entertain myself, or just get by. It's a pretty deep commitment to the attempt to develop a spiritual understanding of life, to plug into something bigger than just me and my ego desire. I feel I've stumbled on the catalyst to actually make a trembling start at this great goal. For the first time in my life, instead of paying it lip service, getting drunk again. But enough of the heavies. I wonder what I'll be saying next year. A friend who had been to McCarthy had been surprised by the quick wedding. She didn't quite get the intellectual match. She remembered Tim as the guy who ate the beavers he trapped. But she trusted Amy's judgment. The friend had asked Amy for a reading list, and Amy then recommended Han Shan's Cold Mountain Poems, translated by Gary Snyder, Peter Matheson's The Snow Leopard, and introductory books on Zen Buddhism and Tao Te Ching. And she thanked her friend for providing a ready ear. Men never understand women the way other women do, I think. And I guess we'd all like to be understood and spoken to on all levels possible. I've been going through so many changes and realizations of late that I almost hesitate to say much. I'm on new ground, good ground and promising ground. I need to watch my step a bit. Trust is such a delicate thing. We have a basic and deeply seated common goal in each of our individual selves, dictating a simple peasant's life. And that lifestyle almost necessitates a partnership for it to endure. There's too much drudgery and quietness for one to go it alone in a place like this for a lifetime. The life is good, but the novelty wears off quickly. The letter ended. I better close here if I'm going to get it on this week's mail plane. I think I could go on forever. The date at the top was February 28th, 1983. The envelope, addressed and stamped, was on the table in their cabin the next morning. It was not mailed until 4 months later. Skip ahead to the end of the next chapter. 2 months after the Mail Day murders, the ashes of Amy Nash came home to the family garden in the hills of western Massachusetts. Amy's father, David, read to a small gathering from her journals and letters. He also read from the letter of a close friend of Amy's in Alaska who said she so admired Amy's courage and her, quote, sense of destiny about going to McCarthy, wrapped in a very spiritual need to live alone, get to know herself again, and cleanse herself of worldly things. And then, having gone there to let go, the friend wrote, she found love, peace of mind, and a home, more than she ever hoped. In a way, I see it as a mystical kind of fulfillment that she was allowed to pass from this world to the next at such a happy time. David Ashenden said they tried to focus on the positive, but Amy's mother, Jo, was haunted by old premonitions and fell into a depression from which she never fully recovered. So I want to conclude with another of the Cold Mountain poems, which was one that really, I think, first drew me to the whole collection of poems, because it seemed like such a, it kind of explains in some ways why people would live in the Wrangles, in a place that was so full of hardship and self-denial. And I was considered it a beautiful expression of a summons to the mountains, to mountain living. But then one time I read it, and I guess I had been working on the story of the murders, and I suddenly thought of the heart of the killer in this poem too, and sort of turned the whole poem inside out. So there are different ways to hear this poem. It's just 8 lines. Men ask the way to Cold Mountain. Cold Mountain, there's no through trail. In summer, ice doesn't melt. The rising sun blurs in swirling fog. How did I make it? My heart is not the same as yours. If your heart was like mine, you'd get it and be right here. Read, I had never done that, so, well, it's a new book, so that's not surprising. So we can do answer questions and have a bit of a conversation, and I was invited to sit down in this chair to do that, so. My mask. So if anybody has any questions about the book or the book process, I'm getting close. I think, yeah, they weren't there. It's a crevasse. So I can answer questions about the 25-year-old who was in the mailing, as well as about other things that have happened since. So if anybody has questions about the book.
I have a question.
Yes.
What did the research for this book look like?
Wow. It was pretty chaotic at times. I think actually the thing I'm like super proud of is the last 30 pages in the book is footnotes or endnotes. I don't know if anybody's read them, but there's some entertaining parts in there, but also it was supposed to intimidate everybody into thinking I knew what I was talking about. Actually, so it's pretty cool when you're writing history with footnotes or endnotes. It's different from writing journalism, because when you're writing in a newspaper, you kind of have to tell the reader where every fact comes from as it comes up. Who said this, and how does a reporter know this paragraph? And so it really creates a pretty bumpy road in terms of telling a story. And there can be exceptions to doing that. And then if you get into writing in magazine journalism, it can be a little different. And so I was lucky to do a couple of pieces a few years back for the New Yorker magazine. And they have this incredible, rigorous fact-checking system that they put my stories through. And the first time they did it, I'd written the whole story, and then I said, okay, we need to now know where every fact, every sentence needs its own footnote. And I thought, what? And it literally took me a week or more to go back through the whole story and figure out, well, where did this come from? Where did that come from? And to do a kind of annotated version of the story for them. So then the second story I did for them, I knew that was coming. And so as I wrote it, I kept much more careful track of where each piece was coming from. And I had a kind of software called Scrivener that would allow me to keep notes off to the side about where things came from. They weren't polished footnotes, but they were, at least I knew where things were coming from. And so that experience was really valuable once I started on this book, because that allowed me to keep track of where everything was coming from. And I did not a great job at that. And I had to go back a lot afterwards and scratch my head and figure out where things came from. But that was kind of my training, because as a newspaper reporter, I really had to get trained in keeping track of my research so carefully. Complex answer.
So the answer to her question then is into the endnotes.
Yeah, you can sort of see that pile of research material and see the range of sources from interviews, and let me say that this book would not be what it was without Jenny Carroll, who was out there in, in 1985 as a graduate student doing research, and sat down with Jim Edwards, who's the homesteader I mentioned, whose story spans such a range of time. And Jenny loaned me a 130-page transcript of her week of conversations in which Jim told his life story. I got to know Jim in my time out there, and I have some great letters from him, and memories of conversations, and even conversations where I took notes, but I don't have anything like what I got from Jenny, and it really made it possible to, because a story like, this is a local history, and so local histories have a tendency to meander and to kind of lose focus, and it can be tough for a reader to get through sometimes. You can dip in and out, but whereas like the Pilgrim family story had that kind of page-turning automatic momentum. So I needed some way to tie this story together other than who's going to get killed, that sort of story. And so the story of Jim Edwards, stretching back all the way to 1953 and through the people he got to know all the way back to Kennecott, really gave me the narrative spine that a book like this needs. And so without having the treasure load, the mother load of information from that interview that she patiently put together, I wouldn't have been able to write this. Yes.
Chidna in your book quite a bit. And if you look at the word chidna, I pronounce it as chitina. You know why they call it chidna?
I don't even know whether my cabin out there is on either it's the Nizina River or the Nizina River. I know that in the Athabascan language, the na suffix is usually a body of water. So I think that Chitna was the copper, what meant Copper River. And so that for the Atna, as I understand it, and maybe, Art might know more, but as I understand it, the Chitna River is, which is the main tributary of the Copper River, the river we know as Copper River, to the original Atna. The Chitna was the meant Copper River, and our Copper River was a tributary of that, because obviously the Atna people knew there was copper up at the headwaters of the Chitna River. Right?
Yeah, it's just kind of folklore pronunciation. It was originally spelled Chittyna. People just swallow it.
Like Shoshana, which is where there was a gold rush, and it's spelled Chizana or Chisna, or it has another na at the end. I mean, if you start to notice all of the na suffixes out there. Yes.
Chris Richards, did you know him at Homer before he moved there, and did you get to talk to him after the murders?
I talked to him a lot after the murders. I didn't know him before, he was actually quite talkative after the murders. When I went out the day after the murders to do my initial story, he of course wasn't there because he was wounded in the attacks and had been flown out, and so he was off in the hospital at that point. But when I went back the next summer to write a story for the Anchorage Daily News about how the town was recovering, and I was out there for a week or more, then I hung out with Chris quite a bit, I kind of talked my ear off in a way.
Before and after, I never saw him after he was up there.
Did you know him before?
I met him briefly.
He was pretty bitter after.
An intense guy. Really
Yeah. He was not not taking part in the program of McCarthy rebuilds. He was still nursing his wounds physically and mentally.
Hadn't even, they had playing Monopoly the night before we go to Hastings. And
Yeah,
he had to run barefoot into the
Right, yeah. And, you know, and so he did tell me all that story, and I was able to put it in here, you know, that sort of eyewitness account of somebody who survived that day. So he was, you know, the kind of person a reporter is always hoping to meet, and hope he'll be talkative instead of just surly and reclusive. So, I mean, he was surly and reclusive and talkative all of them. Yeah. Yeah, Kathy.
Yeah, I read Pilgrim, but that was years ago. And remember your references to your own cabin there and living there. When did your relationship change with the community from reporter to resident?
Well, I wouldn't claim residency to this day, but you know, I think they're pretty well known out that everybody has different gradations of residency out there. And you know, I don't know that probably I'm still a reporter for a lot of people out there, a reporter with a place who gets out here regularly. You know, I have reasons to go out there other than just as a reporter. I don't know that an outsider would have been able to do the research that I did, or would have cared enough to do the research that I did. You know, I think there was a lot of sort of love and passion in pushing the research along as far as I did. But I wrote about it in the Pilgrim book about that question of being a resident or not was a question that Papa Pilgrim, Robert Hale, brought up initially. And he was referring to me as neighbor Tom, as one of, because he was so good at snowing all of his neighbors, he wanted to include me in that group. He was sort of accepting me as a local resident rather than as a newspaper reporter, so that he could, you know, exert his magical spell on me. And I was a savvy enough newspaper reporter to say, okay, I'll take that. And so, you know, I said, yes, I'm neighbor Tom. And we got along great for a while. So he actually read my story, and that didn't work out in the end. It's a long-term relationship. But yeah, it was, so that was an occasion where I was actually, we were playing with that idea of maybe an outsider or an insider. That I still somewhere on the big spectrum in between, I guess I'm there. Do feel like more of an insider in Homer than I did when I first came over the bluff in 1975 to visit Ken and Nancy. That just accrues, I guess, naturally, right? Service stripes.
Is that the only part that's used the arrest and decay?
Well, Kennecott, the old mines and everything was owned by a group that had been mining, actually scratching out the remains of copper off the surface. And two of the main investors in that group were these flying dentist hunters. That's a real, I realized that's a thing in Alaska, flying dentist hunters. So once they were ready to sell out to the Park Service, they were trying to figure out how to, you know, sustain the buildings until they could hand them off to the federal government, because there was no other real use for them. And I think they were uniquely qualified to understand that arrested decay does not work. So I do talk about that a little bit. I come back to arrested decay on that ground. it is a hard concept for architecture as it is for dentistry.
I remember reading about some of the issues that people have about what to do with buildings.
Well, and they've struck a bargain and it's continuing to evolve out there. They've got, a great exhibit now of the past and present it to the visitors and including something of a presentation of what they call the in-between years, that period after the last train left. But really the history books before now have been about the mining days and the building the railroad and the great, epic efforts to conquer the wilderness and get that money out, and the story of the decline and that period after the mining hadn't been told. So that's what I set as my sort of reverse goal, was to write about the part that was, because I think that's part of the American story, what gets left behind, and to simply always go on to the next big project is to only tell half the American experience. So I'm trying to give some voice to the other side.
The part that nobody wants to talk about.
The part that, yeah. So you've got to find a place that's got a lot of good, colorful characters in order to sell that story. And certainly McCarthy seemed to be, to have, it was like, the Bonanza mine was famous because it had this vein, most of the time they find copper mines, big open pit mines with 1% ore is copper. And up here, just this narrow vein in the mountain that was 70% pure copper. They never found anything so rich, but it was very neatly defined. Once they, emptied it out, other than the pillars that they left behind to hold the roof up, they left. So I felt like in researching McCarthy Kennecott, I had found a vein of 70% pure Alaskan.
Thank you for leaving those pillars.
There are a few colors for others. So,
Interested.
yeah. Right.
Did you ever cross paths with any of the descendants of the workers that worked in the mine? Any contact?
Well, Jeremy just forwarded me a email today from some of the Kennecott kids who were reading this book and are all, capital letters, loving it. So that was pretty fun. Of course, they were living there. These were the kids who grew up there before it was abandoned. So this is the story of what happened after they left.
Right.
Yeah. So far, McCarthy, as I write in here, is famous for its feuds and its arguments and divisions, and I'm sort of bracing for this book to be the source of something like that, but it hasn't broken out yet. Which one? We'll see. Yes, thank you, Game of Thrones. Time for snacks?
Well, you have a couple questions from the Zoom.
Oh, that's right, we have. That's right, we did have.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I'm sorry.
no worries. I'm gonna stand up with my mask off so
Good one.
they can hear. So the first one is, how do you balance what an Alaska audience might respond to with a broader audience?
Well, I try to write with a broader audience in mind, I think, generally, and not lapse back into saying, well, Alaskans will be interested in this, so that's good enough. So, I try to keep aiming for the ideal is to write something that's so great that somebody in New York picks it up and says, wow, this is just interesting. I never even thought of Alaska, which is, think back to myself in high school, I'd never even considered Alaska, so you want to sort of draw people into the subject. And that's the highest, best use of a writer's time. But because Alaskans appreciate the story and the setting, they're just primed and ready to read it. I think they will be ready to jump in and go along for that.
Thank you, Tom. I have one more right now. What was the most surprising thing you learned or was revealed to you during research and writing?
Of the parts that I put in the book.
I think, well, I guess let's focus on this book.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you what I took out of this book because then I'd have to write a third one. I would say one candidate for that is learning that in the late 1950s, the Atomic Energy Commission sent a delegation to the Bonanza mine to investigate exploding an atomic bomb inside the mine as a quote, peaceful use of nuclear weapons. This was at the time of the Firecracker Boys and the effort which came close to happening, to using an atomic bomb or several to blow up a harbor and create a harbor up near Point Hope in northern Alaska. And they were just desperate in the late 50s to say, nuclear, people hated atomic bombs. They're not all bad. And they said, look, we can do something else. And they were trying to figure out what that something else was. And one of their ideas was somehow by blowing up this atomic bomb inside the mine and then flooding the mine, that it would loosen all the remaining copper in the mine, and through some sort of electrolysis process, it could leach the copper out of the mine and recover it. Yay, thank you, Atomic Energy Commission. So a historian with the Park Service shared with me this 8-page report that they put out assessing whether it was feasible or not. Not really looking at the nuclear part, but just what's physically left, how could we power this operation if we do it? This was in the late 50s, and they were visiting Kennecott, and they're like in shorts and t-shirts, and they were complaining in this report about it. And then we were down this dark mine, and it was just this chute of ice, and we were freezing. So they got what they deserved. And I refer to them as the mad scientists. So certainly that was something I had never heard of in my years out there, and I don't think most people knew about that.
Oh, there is one more from Pat Garrett. Tom, how did you know when to stop? ... Yes, Kennecott kids love the book.
Yeah. Jeremy stopped me. No, actually, I was 80% done a year ago, and then when the pandemic hit, we thought, well, there's no reason to rush this out until the pandemic's over, because all we could do is Zoom events and meet with people with masks, and what fun would that be? But so the pandemic outlasted us, obviously. That was kind of as a writer, it was a good opportunity for me to go back over the material and, time and again, rewrite, and try to, bring, I can't tell you how many times I had written the Raven story before I realized that the Curse of the Skulls was sitting there in front of me. I mean, I knew that he'd stolen the skulls, and I knew that it was shot in the head and had a bear crush his skull, but it just sort of didn't realize it all fit together as a story the way it does. And so, you take that extra time to do that. And also, I think a lot of those paragraphs that I mentioned where I kind of talk about the meaning of ghost towns in a bigger cultural sense. That was a kind of level of writing that I was able to do with the extra time. And could have been a really great book if I'd had another 2 years.
Great. That's all we have right now.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the people that wanted to blow up an atomic bomb at Kennecott were in any way related to the ones that did the one at Amchitka in the early 70s.
Well, not exactly, because as I recall, that was a military
Yeah,
use one. But I mean, they were related in the sense that, same technology, and they were just trying to find expanded uses because they were getting such bad press for blowing up.
Was Feller part of that one too? It's like,
I don't know if Teller was involved with White Oak and with Kennecott, but not, I mean, the Hempstead.
no, yeah, I meant the chemical. Not-
Yeah, it was the same group. They actually had a big study of a number of possible uses around the West. There were a few of them in Alaska, but, because you could blow it up in Alaska, no one would care, right? I was always afraid when North Korea was menacing America with its missiles that they might fire a few warning shots into Alaska, just to warn the rest of America. Yes.
When I was out in Kennecott, I took a lot of pictures of foundations. And one thing these miners understood was the killing value, the micro killing value, the preserved value of copper and lead. So the iconic red paint and the foundations are really well preserved.
Yeah. Well, it was actually one of the defenses offered in trial of the murderer, was that it somehow absorbed too much copper over the couple of years that he'd been out there, and that affected his mental faculties. It didn't go very far, but that was offered.
Yeah, no,
Well, anybody else, we're gonna take a little break, we're gonna have refreshments, you can ask Tom all the questions that you secretly really want to ask. And just really appreciate this opportunity, and want to again thank Porphyry Press and also the Home Bookstore for giving us this opportunity to host this event, and of course thank Tom. And I'd also like to thank our great museum staff. Thank you so much for organizing this, all of you ladies. And with that, I invite you all into the community room for some refreshments.
Thank you.
All right.